Thank you very much, Stephen. Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I'm very pleased to be here today, and after what I've heard already, what I'm going to tell you, I think fits nicely into the topic of today. So let's move on to it. It's basic science to new therapies, the discovery of GLP-1 and its role in human physiology. So the background is that, we started this work back in the 1970s, and that time obesity was not a problem in Europe at all. And there was also diabetes, but it was something with old people's disease, and there was not a lot you could do about it anyway. No, peptic ulcer disease, that was something that was important. I came from surgery, and we were very interested in this. And some of our patients, it turned out, after the operations, developed hypoglycemia, too low blood glucose. So it was also clear that this was because of insulin. So this was my job to try to find out why was that. Here you see an example of it. You can see in the top, the glucose dives very deep down in hypoglycemia. And this was because of the insulin release. And so something that we did with the operations caused this. And it was clearly coming from the gut because it was only in relationship to meal intake that this happened. So that was the job we started out looking for. And I was immediately attracted by these cells. These are cells in the human gut. They're lighting up with an antibody against glucagon. Now, glucagon comes from the pancreas, of course, and not from the gut. So this is strange. I mean, why was that? Why on earth would there be glucagon in the gut? But on the other hand, glucagon was known to create insulin secretion, so it could be a candidate for this. So we put up this hypothesis, and the reason I show it is that it's from 1973, that something from the gut was responsible for this reactive hypoglycemia. On the graph, you can see the hypoglycemia on the top, and then you can see the stuff that we were measuring. We could measure it already then, that is increased in secretion after a meal intake in these individuals. So we said that this is probably the reason. And it took 20 years, and it was true, but I mean, that's another story. But we found out what was in those cells, and that's the interesting part. It was a peptide. It's called glycentin, 69 amino acids. In the middle, it has glucagon, and that explained why it was the antibodies was reacting with this peptide. But it didn't do anything in itself, so it was not the solution to the solution to the question. On the other hand, it was interesting because it seemed to be a precursor for glucagon. All peptides are produced via precursors, and we could find the bits and pieces also in the pancreas. So this was very likely to be the precursor for glucagon, and people were very interested in precursors these days. It's very exciting. They could cause the release of even more than one hormone. So this is really, really interesting. And then it turned out that proglucagon probably was a little bit bigger than our 69 amino acid peptide. Something was missing, was probably twice as large. So what was in the rest? That was the interesting part. And then there was an American molecular biologist. This was the day when molecular biology all of a sudden made its introduction. And he cloned the cDNA, the coding nucleotides from hamsters. And you can see the structure up there in the middle. To the left, you have glycentin. This was correct. Glycentin was a part of the precursor. But then there was also something else there. There was a stretch that was glucagon-like 1, and there was also an additional one, 2, GLP-2. So this was exactly the information we needed. So we immediately synthesized those stretches as peptides, made radioimmunoassays, antibodies, and started looking for these peptides. And a long story short, what we came up with was that this precursor, which is shown on the top, is processed, as we call it, cleaved differentially, depending on whether this happens in the gut or in the pancreas. In the pancreas, all of these stretches with the glucagon-like peptide 1 and 2 are together in one big molecule that doesn't do anything. So that could have stopped the story there. That would have been the end. But on the other hand, in the gut, they were cleaved out separately. We could show that very clearly, and we could also show that they were secreted. And now we could test them to see, are they doing anything, these peptides? So we did that, and here is my favorite tool. This is a pancreas from a pig. It is very good at making pancreatic juices, you can see, but it also produces insulin, of course. So we could test it, and we tested GLP-1 and GLP-2, and they did absolutely nothing. So again, But what we did then was to say, okay, let's go for the natural peptide. Let's take some extracts of intestines from pigs and from people and use our assays and try to look for it and sequence and do all sorts of chromatographies and purify and so forth. And we ended up being able, we got a pure peptide, we could sequence it and we could test its effect. And now we had insulin release, very, very powerful insulin releasing peptide. And that was, of course, wonderful. So that was the immediate discovery, of course. We had this insulin-releasing peptide from the gut, but there were many things that could increase insulin secretion. But this one was special because it also inhibited glucagon secretion, and as you can see here. And this is important because people with diabetes, they have too much glucagon. That's one of their problems. But this one could inhibit it. And that means that if you have a problem with a high glucose, then you'd like to have insulin doing the job. Insulin is released from the pancreas, makes the blood glucose go down. If you have too low glucose, you have glucagon that will keep up the glucose by increasing the hepatic glucose production. So by having an effect on both glucagon and insulin, you would have a double effect on glucose regulation. And that's exactly what we had. So we looked at this, we infused people with GLP-1, as you can see here in the bottom, and then looked at glucagon concentrations, and you can see that they were inhibited. We could look at insulin, it stimulated, and as a consequence of that, in the middle, we could look at the glucose production in the liver. And it fell by 30%, and that, of course, led to a decrease in blood glucose, but not very much, only by 1 millimole at the most, because these effects were both glucose dependent. You couldn't create hypoglycemia, not very easily at least. So this was new and interesting. So we had a powder that had tremendous effects on glucose. This was interesting, of course. What else did it do? And we spent a lot of time trying to find out what this white powder might do in people. So here's one of the crucial experiments we were looking at: appetite regulation. And as you can see on the top, you have an increased satiety between meals if you infuse people with it. You have a decreased hunger. And as a consequence of that, you had decreased food intake after you had infused them with physiological levels of this hormone. So this was apparently one of the physiological actions of it. And here's an interesting thing. It was dose dependent. The more you could infuse of the peptide, the more people would stop eating, the less nutrients they would take in. This is important as we move ahead. So how does it do that? Isn't that interesting? Is it on the stomach? People say that some of them vomit afterwards. No, it's not on the stomach. Could it be something with the vagal afferents? That's very likely. We won't have time to discuss that. But there could also be central effects. And we looked at that by injecting rats with radioactive GLP-1 and simply looked for it. Where did it go? And it went to this region of the brain, which is called area postrema. This is what is called one of the circumventricular organs. That's sites in the brain where there's some communication with the periphery. And that's where it went, as you can see here. And also, there were receptors for GLP-1 in exactly the same tissue. And even more importantly, if you look at activations of the brain neurons in this region, you can see to the right that they stain with something called phys that indicates activation. And when you give them it, you have the activation. So this is how it does. And there are regions of the brain that are then activated. For instance, this region, which is called amygdala, I'll come back to that, and hypothalamus, where we have the traditional centers for regulation of food intake. So this is what it looks like. These are slides I borrowed from the Novo Nordisk company. To the left, you can see where does semaglutide, the famous one, go? It goes exactly to those circumventricular organs I said. And to the right, you can see, let's see if this works, it does. And to the right, you can see which neurons are activated. And again, you have hypothalamus and amygdala, again, and the nucleus of the tractus of the solitary tract. And these are the regions that are activated. And that's very important because what are we now talking about? We're talking about the reward mechanism, the reward mechanisms. And here you have amygdala and accumbens, which are some of those two regions that are activated when you inject the GLP-1 from the periphery, but still acting on the brain. So how to use this information? It turned out that GLP-1, we found out, didn't live very long in the organism. It was broken down within minutes. The half-life is 1 to 2 minutes. Crazy, crazy. So you can't use that as a medication. But we also found out why. That's because there is an enzyme called DPP4 that cuts away the two N-terminal amino acids, as indicated by the red arrow up there. So this was interesting because if you inject, and that's what we tried, GLP-1 to people, and looked at how much survived in the intact form, you can see the little yellow curve down there. There's absolutely nothing. It's a waste of peptide. It doesn't work. The metabolite is shown in the other graph. So we said, oh, maybe if we inhibit that enzyme, that may work. So that's what we did. And here are some experiments that we did, again, on pigs. To the left, we were infusing the peptide to people, or to the pigs, I'm sorry. And you can see that the yellow curve, that's the intact, the active hormone. And even if we infuse it constantly, we cannot elevate the concentration very much. Then we could give an inhibitor, valine pyrrolidine, in the middle. And then after that, the peptide was completely protected. And then we could look at insulin secretion, and now it was fourfold increased. So it worked. And that, of course, led the pharmaceutical industry. They caught up immediately on that idea. And they were able to do 24-hour lasting DPP4 inhibitors. The most important one is sitagliptin, which is in the middle. Januvia was the name, particularly beneficial in combination with metformin. It was a tremendous success, and Bo Aaron in Sweden showed that during a one-year treatment, here we're looking at long-term glucose concentrations, hemoglobin A1c. In the controls, the green line, it rises, but in those that were treated with the DPP4 inhibitors, it falls below 7, which was exactly the target in those days. And that became a tremendous success. And I'd like to emphasize that because this was one of the pharmaceutical advancements that came out of this, and millions of people all over the globe have been using this medication. But there was another problem. Here's the peptide, again, and the DPP4 in one end. But the other end is also a problem. That's because it's also extracted and destroyed in the kidneys. And that happens with a half-life of 4 to 5 minutes. So if you can solve the DPP4 problem, you still have the problem with the kidneys. And this is what led to the development of the GLP-1 receptor agonists as we know them today. To the left, we have some that are derived from exenatide. That's a different story we'll forget about because they're not really good. But in the middle and to the right, we have the interesting ones. So what was happening was that the GLP-1 sequence was attached to a fatty acid. They did that at the Novo Nordisk company because they had already been producing insulins attaching a fatty acid, the Levemir, and they were almost a day-long acting. So they knew how to do this, and they created the liraglutide molecule, and it worked. Now we had a half-life of 12 hours rather than 2 minutes. That's quite a difference. Semaglutide was a secondary one, a different fatty acid, a different coupling, and it all of a sudden was 1 week in half-life. And that, of course, was extremely helpful. To the bottom, to the right, you have tirzepatide, which is also a GLP-1 agonist. It also has the same prolongation technology, a fatty acid, exactly the same, but it's also a little bit different. It has a slightly different composition. We won't go into the details of that right now, but it's very interesting. So how good are they? And this is what is shown here. How good are they? So this is hemoglobin A1c, the long-term glucose in a large group of people with type 2 diabetes that are being treated with tirzepatide. And what you can see from the top graph is that more than 50% end up after 40 weeks with an A1c of less than 5.7%. 5.7%, that is normal. You can get rid of the diabetes by using this therapy. They were mean enough to compare it to semaglutide, the blue curve up there, which didn't do quite as well. What else do we have of sensations? Now, here is the second sensation. This is semaglutide in a cardiovascular outcome trial and over 2 years. And what you are looking at here is major adverse cardiovascular events, death, myocardial infarction, stroke, things like that. And you can see that you could reduce that by 26% over this period of 2 years. Another, actually unexpected sensation. Here is, of course, today we already have a meta-analysis of all the cardiovascular outcome trials that have been performed, and here we have them all. And you can see that all that are to the left of the 1.0 line, they are positive, they work. The only two that doesn't work are the ones that are based on Exendin, probably because of pharmacokinetics. Forget about that. So the real ones, the good ones, they all work on cardiovascular safety and reduce the risk. What else does it do? So here we have stroke. This is semaglutide in people with diabetes, and a very significant reduction in the frequency of stroke during therapy in 2 years here. Again, a very important improvement because stroke is difficult. Now, this is dementia, and this was a very recent systematic review and a meta-analysis, and you can see that this was a group of 26 randomized controlled trials with 160,000 individuals in. 10 of them were with GLP-1 receptor agonists, and the other half was with SGLT2 inhibitors, another very important and good diabetes medicine, I must say. So overall, this group did not show any reduction in dementia, but if you looked at the GLP-1 receptors alone, there was a 45% reduction in the occurrence of dementia. And the SGLT2s, there was actually, not as significant, but an increase. So this is really interesting. It leads us to the question of Alzheimer. So there are observational studies out now in very large materials that suggest that there will be a reduced risk by 40 to 70% of Alzheimer's diagnosis in people with type 2 when they're treated with GLP-1 receptor agonists. There are 2 big controlled trials on their way. They will be finished around Christmas this year. They're called EVOKE trials. It will be extremely interesting to see if that still holds true. So another thing, I said this about the reward mechanism. This doesn't only apply to food intake, but also to opioid and alcohol use disorders. So here are observational studies on a very large number of patients because now it's almost 20% of the American population that has been on a GLP-1 agonist. That many. Okay, but here 500,000 and 800,000 with opioid abuse and alcohol abuse, and you can see that the reductions are about 50% in those that are taking the medication. So this works, and probably because of the reward mechanism inhibition. So kidney problems are among the most important, and this is a recent meta-analysis again from all the most prominent kidney people in the world, and they've come down with studied 11 trials with 85,000 individuals here, and there's a reduction by almost 20% of the people of the occurrence of progression of kidney disease or even improvement. So how does it do it? There are fantastic effects on a number of things, as I've alluded to, described, but let me also emphasize that there are actions on receptors on the blood vessels. And blood vessels is common for all the organs in the body, of course. And that can explain why this compound has effects on so many systems. And it also has effects on inflammation. So if you look at inflammatory markers, you can reduce these inflammatory markers very significantly. But of course, there is also the obesity thing, and obesity is in itself associated with a lot of complications, of course. So what happens? So this is semaglutide, and here we have an 18% weight loss over 68 weeks, and that changed the world that day. That was the change. And they also did a cardiovascular outcome trial in this population. 17,600 people were looked at for 4 years. And there was a reduction by 20% in cardiovascular mortality and complications. So this means that not only those with diabetes will benefit from this, but all those with the metabolic syndrome and obesity will also benefit from this. So what about the competitors? What about tirzepatide? Here's SURMOUNT-4 with tirzepatide, 88 weeks. The weight loss is here 26%. Really big weight loss. And even more importantly, the SURMOUNT-1 trial here, that's the first of these trials of tirzepatide in the high dose, shows that it had a wonderful effect on body weight, but also it was followed for 3 years, and they were looking at the incidence of new diabetes, because the risk of obesity is, first of all, that you will develop diabetes. And what happened? It disappeared. A reduction by 94%. Amazing. So who will win? I don't know. But here are some of the trajectories of weight loss in time. And what I've put here are some of the new stuff. Right now we have the conclusion of the ADA, American Diabetes Association, and a lot of new stuff have been presented. And I plotted semaglutide on and a high dose here, the triangle, and I put it on top of the curve for tirzepatide, and they're completely identical. So whether there is a big difference between them or not, I'm not sure. I've put amycretin, which is another one from the Novo Nordisk company, on top of retatrutide, which is a triple agonist, which is very highly talked about. It's exactly the same. So that is not the most important thing. So rather we should ask, 40% stay 1 year after they have been prescribed a GLP-1 receptor agonist. Why is that? Okay, lesson number one in pharmacology, everybody stops taking their medicine. Costs, you addressed that already. Very, very important. Let's do something about that. I don't know exactly what, but let's do something about it. And they will come down, I assure you. Some will stop when the desired weight loss has been obtained. If you don't do anything else, it's a bad idea. Some people do have the side effects, and the side effects will actually decide which of all these compounds will win, because we need to reduce the side effects. And then loss of reward. Oops. Perhaps it's not so fun to be on one of these medications if it takes away the pleasure of a good meal, the pleasure of a good glass of red wine, and it does, to some people at least. So that can be another explanation. And I'm saying this because, if you worry about half the globe to be on a GLP-1 receptor agonist, forget it, they won't. So what do? The most important that you can do is to use this period, which is up to 2 years of treatment, when you lose weight, to change your habits, your exercise habits and your food habits. And the good news is you can do it. Because of the weight loss and the anti-inflammatory actions, you will be better. You can move around. You can get up out of the chair. You can walk. And all it takes is a 30-minute walk every day. And you can change your diet, because you're not so interested anymore. You're not completely obsessed with what you put in your mouth. You can do it. You have your will back. So this is what is demonstrated in the graph here, that if you combine exercise with medication, then you can maintain the weight loss even after the termination of the therapy. So what I've said is that GLP-1 is an insulin-tropic peptide. It inhibits glucagon secretion also. This is a double action. It inhibits food intake and appetite. It acts on the brain. And it shows that these are very effective in obesity and diabetes, and they improve the blood vessels and inhibit the reward system. They have protective effects on the cardiovascular system and offer renal and neuroprotection. And I've told you that the best explanation for this is that they act on the circulation and on the inflammation. So there will be some busy years ahead for you here, because there will be a lot of new compounds that will all apply to the medicines agencies, not only in the United States, but also here in Europe, definitely. Thank you very much.